One of the questions that I'm asked most often is how do you get part of the picture in focus and the rest of it out of focus? So I'm going to just talk about that again today. It's something I have mentioned before, I know, several times probably, but it is one that seems to throw a lot of people, and I think it's really people who don't understand the exposure triangle, because once you understand that, I've said this before, but then you open up all the creative possibilities of your camera, or pretty much all of them. So going back to that question, how do you get that kind of shot? Well, it comes down to understanding a few things, and I've already mentioned the exposure triangle, and if you're not familiar with that, that's basically the relationship between the shutter speed you're using, how fast how long the shutter is open. Might be a long time, might be a very short time. The sensitivity of let's say the sensor, your ISO or your film, if you're using film. And the key thing that we're looking at here is aperture. So the aperture is how big is the opening in the lens that's letting in light, because aperture does two things for you. One is it controls how much light is coming in through the lens. It's either a lot of light or very little light or somewhere in between. But it also controls, because of the way the optics work, it also directly controls how much of the picture is in focus and how much is out of focus. So when you're taking a photograph, you will have set your focus on your subject, either manually or using autofocus. And then the aperture setting and the distance that you are from your subject will determine how much of the subject is in focus and what else is in focus, both in the foreground and in the background. So I'm hoping that's making sense. So very simply, so you need to be familiar with F numbers, okay? You don't need to know exactly what they mean, doesn't really matter, but you just need to know that there are certain numbers when you look at aperture that normally have an F against them. And if you've got a bigger number like F22, that means that the aperture size is very small. So we call that stopping down the lens, but it basically means that the hole that the light is coming through the lens is quite small, but it means your depth of field is very big. So a big F number means big depth field. You might see that as 1/22, but that 22 is the thing to think about, or somewhere around there. So if it's a number like 22, you've got pretty much everything is going to be in focus. And if you're using a much smaller number, it might be 2.8, for example, if you go down that small. That means the aperture is actually very big compared to the diameter of the lens. But the thing you need to just remember here, so I'm trying to simplify this as much as possible. The thing to remember with a small number is that you've got a very small depth of field. And that simply means that what's in focus, both in front of and behind the thing you've actually focused on, will be very small. So just taking an example, obviously this is a lot easier to show than it is to describe verbally, but we'll have a go. So let's say you are taking a portrait of somebody and they are, let's say, about 4 meters from you. And then behind them, you've got a wall, and that's another 4 meters away. So you've got this spacing going on. So what's the first thing you do? Well, the thing that you do when you're taking a portrait of somebody is you focus on one of their eyes. I usually go for the eye that's closest to me, and that is my focal point. Now, in order to get that to work, if you're doing something like a static photograph, you might want to use manual focus. And just as a tip, not all cameras have this, but certainly all older cameras pretty much had this. And you'll find that most new ones will, as far as I'm aware, also have this. There's a little circle. If you look at the top of your camera, you'll see a symbol with a circle with a line through it. And that line is sort of parallel to the back of the camera, the front of the camera. What that's doing it's showing you precisely where the sensor or the film is in the camera body. So if you do need to actually do the old-fashioned way, let's say, and use a tape measure, you know exactly where you have to measure from and to. So that's the first thing. So you've got to get your focus right. So you might choose manual focus, you might choose autofocus. If you're using autofocus, the thing to do there is to make sure that your autofocus is set on one focal point. And I tend to use the focal point that's dead center in the camera. So again, you need to have a little bit of an understanding of how your autofocus works on your camera, but generally you'll have a choice of doing either a single point or a little group of points. And that might be 9 points, it might be 16, or you'll have some larger zone. So that will depend on the camera that you have, and it's worth Googling if you don't have the camera manual, or looking at the camera manual, but doing a quick Google just to understand how to set that up. But I always use just a single AF point, and that's set up on my cameras, and I don't change that because that's how I like to work. So you have so far got your subject, you're 4 meters away, the background is 4 meters behind them, and you have now focused on one of their eyes. So how does this work in practice? Well, if you've got f/22 set, so remember the big number, big depth of field, what's likely to be the case is that everything between you and your subject is in focus, and everything behind is also in focus. So that wall behind your subject is going to be in focus. As you reduce that number, as you make that f/22 smaller, so you might drop it to f/11 or f/8 or f/5.6 or f/2.8, what happens is the background in this particular scenario is what you're really going to be interested in. That will begin to go out of focus. So if you've got a solid color behind you, it's not such a big deal because that won't be a distraction anyway. But let's say you've got a brick wall. What you'll begin to see happening is that those bricks, that brickwork behind your subject starts to go out of focus. And as you get down to 5.6 and definitely 2.8, that's going to be really blurry in the background. What is also likely to happen, particularly when you're getting to f5.6 and definitely at 2.8, or at least the chances are, this will depend a little bit on your lens, but you'll begin to see that the back of the person's head may also start to go out of focus, so their ears, and may also be the tip of their nose, but probably not at that distance, because the other thing that influences depth of field is how far away you are from your subject. So if you were to not be 4 meters away, but be 2 meters away, so 6 feet roughly, and it's a good thing to practice actually. Do a scenario. It doesn't have to be a person. You could just use an object and keep the background the same distance away, but move yourself. Focus on the same thing, but look at the difference that selecting a different aperture has on the subject themselves. Now, it's useful to have something that has a bit of depth to it, so somebody's head is useful. A ball, football or basketball or whatever it is. But something like that, where you can see if the back of the ball and the front of the ball are starting to go out of focus, because that gives you a really good feel for what these settings do on your camera and lens combination. And once you start understanding that relationship, you get full creative control of what's in focus and what isn't. And understanding depth of field, being able to control what parts of the photograph are in focus, what parts aren't, to me is one of the biggest things you can do to start producing really impactful photographs. Because what you're doing is you are guiding the viewer's eye or drawing the viewer's eye to your subject, even though you've got other things around. And when I've spoken about portrait work, if you've ever been on one of my portrait webinars, I talk about using the background to create some context for the subject. And the example I normally give is somebody who designs boats, and you could place them in like a little marina. You could place them in a workshop where boats are being built. You could place them in their office where they're doing design work, probably on a computer these days. But if you have that background there, the trick is to have your subject, that person, in sharp focus, but have the background a little bit out of focus, so that the background isn't competing with the subject for attention, but it provides context, but it's definitely secondary to the person, because what you're doing is you're placing the person into that environment and you're telling some of their stories. So this is where we go to the visual storyteller idea, which is something else that I tend to talk about quite a lot. If you listen to other podcasts, or you've been on any of the webinars, or you've done any of my courses. So depth of field is a really key thing, and understanding it is really important. So just to recap at this point, what are the things you need to be thinking about when you're looking at depth of field? So the first one on the camera is getting your aperture correct, because that will have the biggest impact on depth of field. People might argue with me on this one, but I'm going to just stick with that for now for the purposes of this. So on the camera, I'll qualify myself, that will have the biggest impact. Obviously, you need to compensate with either shutter speed or ISO to make sure you've got the correct exposure, because it's all very well having a nicely composed depth of field shot, but it's not much good if it's either totally overexposed or completely underexposed and you can't actually see much of anything. So you do need to understand that relationship, but I spoke in the last or a few podcasts ago about setting the priority on your camera, whether that's shutter speed or aperture. So here you would use aperture priority in your modes. And if you don't know your modes, do my course or look it up. So you set aperture priority, and that's the thing you're going to change manually. And then the camera will compensate, usually with shutter speed, so to make sure you've got the correct exposure. So you just need to make sure that the shutter speed is usable for what you want to do. Because if you're taking a static portrait of somebody where they're not moving, then you can get away with a relatively low shutter speed, as long as you're not getting into the kind of areas where you need a tripod, or you might want to use a tripod, whatever it is. If you're doing sports photography, though, where things are moving, then you need to make sure that you still have a fast enough shutter speed, and that's where you would change the ISO. So if you're starting to get baffled by this, I'm kind of deliberately talking about these settings, because to get the most from your camera, you really have to have a basic understanding at least, or at least basically understand that relationship. So if you don't understand this, do a course. I do these courses, but understand it, because once you'll be doing yourself a big favor, because once you understand that relationship, you open up the creative potential of your camera. Now, some people get confused by it. They think it's really complicated, and there's lots and lots of numbers and different things like f-stops that I've already mentioned, and shutter speeds and all of this. But if you drive a car, you are already aware of a relationship. You're already using it, and you may not be, and you probably don't know all the technicalities. And that relationship is when you press the accelerator pedal, the throttle pedal, the gas pedal, whatever you call it. What happens when you press that pedal down? Well, your car goes faster, but also you use more fuel. Now, most people, I think, who drive a car would understand that relationship. I certainly hope they do, at least the first bits, with putting your foot down and going faster. Do you know how much pressure you're applying with your foot in pounds torque, Newton meters, whatever it might be? I'd say no. I mean, I certainly have no idea what I'm doing. When it comes to speed, yeah, you probably understand that one, because how many miles an hour, how many kilometers per hour you're doing. Because if you don't get that one, you may well find driving is quite an expensive experience, and you won't be doing it for very long when you lose your license because you're speeding all the time. But you'll understand those numbers. And then the final one is, what's the fuel consumption? How many miles per gallon? What difference? What MPG were you doing? What does that drop to? Or litres per 100 kilometres? And the chances are you probably don't know those numbers either. But the point I'm trying to make is you've got a working knowledge of that three-way relationship, even though you don't necessarily know what all of the numbers are. You might just know one of those numbers, which is the speed. And the relationship the exposure triangle, that relationship between shutter speed, aperture, and ISO is very similar. It's useful to know the numbers, and certainly professional photographers would know them, or at least the numbers they use regularly. If you're a beginner, you're a hobbyist, you're new to photography, you don't need to know all of those numbers, but it is useful to understand the aperture numbers and the shutter speed numbers, frankly, because that will, it's worth spending a little bit of time just getting to know those and practicing. So one of the ways you can do that is to do this kind of static test that I've just been describing with depth of field. And another way of using it is just, if you are into sports photography, do the same kind of thing. Make sure you've got a fast shutter speed to freeze the action. And again, use a single AF point, so you're absolutely focused on the thing, the person, whatever it is that you want to be in sharp focus, and then let the camera do the rest. You change the aperture setting to change what your depth of field is. So you might want the person, let's say if it's soccer, for example, the person kicking the ball, and you want the background there, but out of focus, because again, you've set context, but you're drawing everybody's eye to the player in that instance. Now, one other thing I'm going to add to this is a thing called back button focus, which you may have heard about. And it's something I use a lot. And what it is, as standard on your camera, the way the camera knows when to look and when to set the focus is when you press the shutter button halfway down. That's the point where the camera says, okay, what's going on? It will set out, it will do the exposure setting for you. If that is automated, it will decide what the focus point is with your autofocus. If that's switched on. So basically when you push that shutter button halfway down, that's when the camera wakes up, does its thing, and then when you push it all the way down, that's when it takes the photograph. The problem is that I've already said that I use a single point on my AF. I do use AF quite a lot, and I use the one right in the center of the screen. So that's, to me, quite useful, because that's generally also where the exposure setting is taken, although you can also vary that on your camera depending on what camera you have. However, when it comes to composition, I don't necessarily want my subject dead center in the photograph. To me, that's usually quite a boring photograph unless I'm doing it for a balance, sort of create some symmetry in the image. So the reason for using back button focus is that it allows you to set your focal point, but if your subject doesn't change how far away it is from you or they are from you, you can recompose them in the image without having the AF trying to focus on something else, because you've just put your AF point over something in the background that you actually don't want to focus on. So what is back button focus? Is simply a setting you can change in your camera if you have it, where you tell the camera to take the AF setting when you press a different button. And normally it's a button on the back of the camera. So on a lot of cameras, you'll have 2, 3, 4 buttons on the back near where the shutter button is, which is usually on the top. And you simply reprogram one of those buttons to be your AF button. And then you would use a continuous autofocus normally, or you might want to do a single AF. So again, you need to look at how your autofocus works. But once you've done that, it means that you are setting the focus using this button on the back. It's separate from the shutter button. And once you've set the focus, you can leave it there. So an example of this, if I'm photographing a bird flying across a load of buildings and then a gap and it's just sky, obviously if I get my focus, my AF point on the building or the sky, well, the building's going to be a certain distance away. The sky's going to be infinity away as far as the camera's concerned. So my bird is unlikely to be in focus with either of those two settings. So it means I can just set my AF, my focal length on the bird, and then leave it there and just recompose and shoot the picture as I need to. And the depth of field that I've selected will tell me how long that bird will stay in focus as long as it doesn't change its distance from me too often. I hope this is making a bit of sense. It's look, you may not want to do back button focus, but if you are starting to get into your photography a bit more and you want a lot more creative control over what you're doing, back button focus is definitely something to take a look at. It takes a little bit of practice to get used to doing it that way, but it's something I do all the time now, and I think it makes a big difference. This is especially true if I'm trying to photograph an animal through trees, for example. If I'm or grass, long grass, I've got to find a point where the animal's head is so that I can focus on it. But having set that focus, I'll recompose so that my animal is usually, I generally don't have my focal point dead center in the image. So this is where one of the places where back button can be quite useful. The other thing I just wanted to mention is macro photography. So macro is simply where you are photographing something that is really close to the lens. You might be talking millimeters or fractions of an inch. So I mentioned that the other thing that determines how much is in focus in front of your focal point and behind the focal point is how far away you are from your subject. So if you are using an aperture number, so let's say 5.6, and you are 10 millimeters from your subject, you are going to have a very fine slice of creature that's actually in focus. Now, you may want to do that, or you might be better off setting it to f/22, and then you've got a lot of stuff will be in focus. So if you do get into macro, it's quite a fun thing to work with. And I'm sort of thinking of some of those insect pictures you see. They're amazing. And that's macro. But a friend of mine likes to shoot model railway carriages, things like that in macro. And that's great because you can create a real sense of size and space by using a very narrow depth of field. But you would generally use a macro lens. So not all lenses are macro lenses. All lenses have a minimum focal distance. So if you get closer than that, the lens can't focus. So if you do want that close focus capability, you're going to need a lens that has a macro capability, and that will allow you to focus very close to the end of the lens. So I've spoken about a few things there. So the primary thing was to talk about focus and how you get get your subject in focus and then everything else out of focus. There's a little bit more to it, but this is, I think, in this podcast adequate to get you going. If you are not familiar with how to do that, how to get that kind of a shot where your subject's in sharp focus and the background is out of focus. As with all of these things, the best thing you can do is to experiment. So I would suggest the best way to start, if you have a tripod, put your camera on a tripod, have a static subject, and then just set your camera to aperture priority, set your autofocus to a single point, and then just take a series of photographs where all you change is the aperture. So start at f/22, drop it to f/11, go to f/8, go to f/5.6, go to f/2.8 or whatever smaller number you have below that. You may not have a 2.8 or you might have 2, depends on the lens you're using. So take those series of photographs and then halve the distance and move your camera closer to the subject by half the distance. So if you're 4 meters away initially, close up so that you're 2 meters away, refocus, and then do exactly the same thing and look at what the difference is. It's particularly useful if you've got a subject that has some depth to it. So it doesn't have to be a person's head. It could be a car. If you got a car, maybe go 4 meters from the car. Maybe have it at a slight angle to you, so you're not looking directly at the front of it, and have something in the background, maybe a garage or a wall or whatever it is, and try that sort of a setup. But just experiment, and that will show you on your own camera and lens combination, first of all, how to do it and how to do it so that it works, but also what kind of results you can get. And the more you practice that, the more familiar you are with it, the more effective you get when you have to do it live. So whether it's maybe at a sports event or when you're on holiday, on vacation somewhere, whatever it is, because you've put that practice in and you have that understanding of how things work, that will definitely make a big improvement to your photography. Okay, so that is it for this podcast. I hope you found that useful. Have fun with your photography, and I'll speak to you in the next podcast. Oh, and don't forget my courses, so have a look. Bye for now. Oh, and one thing just before you go, please take a look at the 2026 Wildlife Calendar. That's available now. It's on the website. There's a link below the description of this podcast episode. So please take a look, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye now.